It only takes one decision, made in a few careless seconds, for an entire world to tilt off its axis. One moment, everything feels ordinary. The next, the ground beneath familiar routines quietly disappears. And the most unsettling part is this: when that moment arrives, no one involved ever recognizes it for what it truly is. What began as a rushed choice inside a tight, unofficial network didn't look like history in the making. It looked small, temporary, fixable. The kind of mistake people assume will fade with time if handled quickly enough. In places where money changes hands in whispers and trust is measured in silence, mistakes are often treated like inconveniences rather than warnings. That belief is what allowed everything that followed to unfold. At first, there was only confusion. Messages passed between familiar contacts, each one shorter and more urgent than the last. A sense of unease spread, but no one fully understood the scale of what had just happened. Within these circles, problems were usually resolved through quiet negotiation. Pressure existed, but it was controlled. This time, the balance felt different from the start, even if no one wanted to admit it. The fear didn't arrive loudly. It arrived subtly, through changes in tone, through pauses where there used to be confidence, through questions that replaced certainty. People who once moved freely began checking their surroundings more often. Doors were locked more tightly. Cars changed routes, and conversations that once happened face-to-face shifted into shorter, cautious exchanges. When systems operate on reputation, even minor disruption feels like an earthquake. The idea that something could be taken without permission sent a wave of instability far beyond the original act itself. It challenged the invisible rules that held everything in place, and once those rules were questioned, the entire structure began to feel fragile. What made the situation even more dangerous was how quickly panic replaced calculation. Decisions were no longer slow and strategic. They became reactive, emotional. People guessed instead of confirmed. They assumed instead of verified. And in worlds built on precision, assumption is the most dangerous habit of all. The atmosphere grew heavier by the hour. Sleep became difficult. Phones were checked constantly. Silence felt louder than noise. Everyone involved believed they were watching the situation, but in reality, the situation was already moving faster than anyone could track. The deeper truth of that early moment is that it wasn't just about loss. It was about what that loss represented. In certain circles, dignity and control are treated as the same thing. To lose one is to lose both, and once control is questioned, everything attached to it feels unstable. What followed was a chain reaction no one had planned for. Small actions began producing consequences far larger than expected. One rushed decision required another to contain it, then another to correct that one. Each step pushed the situation further away from its point of origin and closer to a place where control could no longer be recovered. Fear doesn't simply make people flee. Sometimes it makes them chase. Sometimes it convinces them that acting fast is safer than stepping back. And when multiple people are afraid at the same time, the entire environment becomes unpredictable. What makes these stories so unsettling is not that chaos appears suddenly. It's that chaos builds quietly under the surface of normal life. Streets still look the same. Businesses still open. People still laugh in passing. But behind those ordinary rhythms, pressure tightens in ways no camera could ever capture. In the early stages, everyone involved still believed the situation could be contained. That belief became the fuel for everything that followed. Instead of slowing down, they sped up. Instead of widening perspective, they narrowed it. Every choice became focused on immediate survival rather than long-term consequence. The panic wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Where to go, who to contact, what to say, what not to say. These questions looped endlessly through exhausted minds, and each answer created new risks no one had the clarity to truly assess. This is how the most devastating consequences often begin, not with hatred, but with pressure, not with plans, but with reactions, not with intent, but with fear layered on top of fear. With every passing hour, options shrank. What once felt like freedom of choice slowly turned into a narrowing corridor with fewer exits. And as that corridor tightened, it became harder to tell where danger truly was. Every silence felt suspicious, every message felt loaded, every movement felt observed, even when it wasn't. In moments like these, logic is present, but it no longer leads. Emotion takes the wheel, and emotion does not calculate outcomes, it only responds to discomfort. What's haunting about this particular story is how ordinary its beginning was. There was no declaration, no instant rupture, just one action that people told themselves they could fix. That belief lingered just long enough for the situation to pass the point where fixing it was still possible. By the time the weight of the consequences became visible, the structure that once kept things stable had already shifted beyond recognition. Trust began to erode, loyalty became questioned, familiar relationships turned uncertain, and uncertainty is where fear grows fastest. To outsiders, later events would appear sudden, but to those inside the unfolding chain of choices, everything felt like a slow building inevitability. Each step felt forced by the one before it. Responsibility became blurred. Everyone could point backward. No one could clearly see forward. And perhaps the most tragic truth of all is that in the beginning, no one believed the ending would reach the scale that it did. Everyone believed there was still time, still room to correct, still a way to walk it back. But time does not pause for hesitation, and pressure does not release simply because people wish it would. The initial moment passed quickly, but its echo stretched far beyond that first decision. It moved through conversations, through late-night messages, through sleepless hours and hurried plans, and with each repetition, it grew heavier. What was once a single mistake became a permanent turning point, not because it was especially dramatic, but because it was never truly undone. And that is the quiet danger behind moments like these. They don't announce themselves as beginnings. They disguise themselves as problems that can be handled, as setbacks that can be corrected, as complications that will eventually fade. But some moments do not fade. Some moments simply wait.
Some moments simply wait, and when they move again, they return with a force shaped by everything that was left unresolved. In the space that followed that first mistake, authority became the most valuable currency of all. Not authority written down or formally recognized, but the kind enforced through reputation, history, and the quiet understanding of what happens when control is challenged. At the center of this tightening circle stood a figure whose influence had never depended on visibility. Power had always flowed through messages passed indirectly, through decisions made without public discussion, through outcomes that seemed to arrive without explanation. For years, that influence had remained unquestioned. That was its strength. And when the loss occurred, it wasn't just property that vanished, it was certainty. Certainty that the invisible boundaries would always be respected. In environments built on control, allowing a loss to remain unanswered sends a message far louder than any confrontation ever could. It suggests weakness. It implies hesitation, and hesitation invites repetition. This is the unspoken rule that governs such spaces. What goes unchallenged becomes permitted, and what becomes permitted soon becomes expected. So the response did not grow out of anger alone. It grew out of something colder, the need to restore balance as it had always been understood. The goal was not revenge in a dramatic sense, but correction, a reset, a message that the old rules still applied, that authority had not shifted, even if the moment had. Those inside the network began to feel the temperature change. Conversations became shorter. Instructions became firmer. The air of uncertainty transformed into a sense of direction. but not a comforting one. It was the direction of inevitability. When power tightens its grip, it rarely does so with noise. It does so with quiet efficiency. What unfolded next was driven not by chaos, but by determination, a refusal to allow the system to bend, a refusal to accept loss without response. In this world, to step back is to invite erosion, and erosion, once it begins, rarely stops on its own. The pursuit that followed was shaped by reputation more than rage. The idea that a challenge had occurred was itself the threat. Allowing that challenge to stand would change the entire structure. Others would begin to test the edges. Lines would blur. Certainty would fracture. And once that happens, control becomes negotiation. Negotiation becomes compromise. And compromise in these systems is seen as collapse. So pressure increased, not in loud displays, but in subtle movements. Routes narrowed. Options shrank. The space of safety grew smaller with each passing day. Those caught between power and fear often find themselves paralyzed, unsure whether to run or to wait. And waiting in such situations can feel safer than movement, until it suddenly isn't. The psychology of authority is complex. It feeds on predictability. It depends on being seen as unwavering. Even when doubt creeps in privately, it cannot be allowed to exist publicly. Public certainty becomes the armor, and that armor must be defended at all costs. What's rarely understood from the outside is that the person at the center of such authority is also imprisoned by it. Once you become the symbol of control, you no longer act as freely as others believe. Every decision carries weight beyond itself. Every action is interpreted. Every silence becomes part of the message. The role shapes the person as much as the person shapes the role. In this case, refusal to accept loss was not just personal. It was structural. It was about maintaining the gravity that held everything else in orbit. If that gravity weakened, the entire system would drift toward disorder. As pressure intensified, those on the outer edges began to feel it first. The people who once lived in the margins of the operation suddenly found those margins shrinking. Uncertainty spilled downward. Tension spread laterally. Fear traveled faster than facts. And in that climate, perception often replaced truth. Some believed the pursuit would end quickly. Others believed it would never truly end at all. And both beliefs were rooted in the same understanding, that authority commits to restoration, it does not easily disengage. The tragedy of power built on fear is that it consumes both directions at once. It holds others in place, but it also locks the one who wields it into a single path forward. There is no retreat without consequence, no pause without interpretation, no softness without risk. But above all this resolve, something fragile remained. Because power sustained through reputation alone is always one interruption away from exposure. It requires constant reinforcement, constant reminders, constant alignment between belief and outcome. Without that alignment, authority begins to look like performance rather than truth. As days passed, the weight of the situation pressed inward from all sides. The earlier panic transformed into a thick, suffocating tension. Everyone involved felt the narrowing of possible outcomes. Choices that once seemed available slowly closed themselves off. What remained felt less like decision-making and more like momentum. The refusal to back down hardened into a position that could no longer be softened. And when positions harden, flexibility disappears. What follows is not escalation driven by emotion, but continuation driven by obligation. Each move is made not because it is desired, but because it is expected. This is the hidden trap of power. Once it defines you, escaping it feels more dangerous than obeying it. Inside this narrowing path, the human cost becomes invisible to those at the center. Individuals turn into variables. Outcomes replace experiences. distance grows between decision and consequence, and that distance makes it easier to continue moving forward without fully acknowledging what is being shaped along the way. From afar, later observers would try to assign clear motives: anger, fear, greed, control. But the truth is far more entangled. It is built from layers of expectation, history, pride, and the silent pressure to never appear uncertain in a world that feeds on doubt. And so the pursuit continued, not as a burst of chaos, but as a tightening loop. Every step taken narrowed the next. Every attempt to regain control further limited the paths back to safety. What originally began as a correction quietly transformed into a point of no return. Those caught between began to realize that neutrality was no longer possible. Silence became a position. Stillness became a statement. And in that environment, even doing nothing felt like choosing a side. The most unsettling part is that to the outside world, nothing seemed different. Streets remained ordinary. Daily life continued uninterrupted. There were no visible signs of the pressure building beneath the surface, and that invisibility allowed the tension to grow unchecked. Authority sustained by fear does not require spectacle. It only requires belief. And belief, once established, can move people faster than force ever could. By the time the full weight of the refusal to back down became impossible to ignore, the original moment that triggered everything felt distant, almost insignificant in contrast to what it had unleashed. The system was no longer responding to a loss, it was responding to itself. At that point, the direction forward was no longer chosen. It had already been set by the expectations layered over years of control. Power does not easily change course. It continues until something stops it. And with every passing moment, that stopping point drew closer, not as a dramatic collision, but as a quiet convergence of pressure, inevitability, and exhausted resolve. Because when authority refuses to bend, the only thing it can do next is break something around it. And that is where the final chapter of this story begins to take shape. Not in an explosion of sound, but in the stillness that follows, a decision no one believes can be undone.
And that stillness, once it settles, has a strange way of drawing everything toward it. After so much movement shaped by pressure and expectation, the world seems to pause. Not because everything is resolved, but because every possible motion now carries consequence. It's in this quiet space that the truth begins to surface, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Small details, overlooked patterns, digital traces left behind by habits that once felt safe. What follows is not a dramatic chase, as it might appear in fiction. It is slower, colder, methodical. Modern investigations rarely rely on single moments anymore. They rely on echoes, messages sent late at night, movements tracked over distance. Connections revealed not by confession, but by data, quietly assembling itself in the background. What people trust most often becomes the very thing that watches them. In the beginning, technology feels like protection. Messages can be erased, conversations can be hidden, locations can seem invisible. But over time, the volume of communication becomes its own form of exposure. Every contact creates a thread. Every thread strengthens a web. And once enough threads exist, the shape of that web becomes unmistakable. The investigation does not burst into life with sirens or headlines. It grows silently, just like the network it is observing. Analysts begin to notice repetition. Patterns emerge where randomness once seemed to rule. Timelines align. Gaps in stories reveal themselves. And slowly, the invisible begins to develop an outline. What makes this stage so unsettling is how unaware its subjects often are. Life continues. Daily routines resume their familiar rhythm. Phones are checked, messages are sent, movements continue as they always have. Nothing feels different on the surface.
And yet, beneath all of it, attention has already arrived. The digital world never forgets in the way people assume it does. Even silence becomes information. Even deleted messages leave behind the memory of absence. What once felt like freedom of movement begins to shrink without anyone noticing the walls drawing closer. As the picture sharpens, the story that emerges is rarely simple. It is layered, contradictory, filled with overlapping motives and intersecting paths. Investigators do not look for villains in isolation. They look for structure, for systems, for the architecture that allows choices to connect. One of the most powerful truths of this phase is that no one stands entirely alone anymore. Every individual is now part of a map, and on that map, distance no longer equals separation. People who believe themselves to be far removed from consequence often find that they are only a few steps away through someone else's connection. What the digital trail reveals is not just movement, but mindset, the rhythm of messages, the urgency and timing, the silence between exchanges. All of it tells a story, one that does not rely on memory or interpretation alone, but on record. And yet, even at this stage, certainty is never immediate. The net does not close with force. It tightens with patience. Each piece is tested against another. Each assumption is verified again and again. Modern investigations move slowly because they cannot afford to move incorrectly. For those being watched, this feels like relief. Days pass without consequence. Weeks turn into distance from the original moment. Anxiety softens. Vigilance fades. The illusion of escape returns. Time begins to feel like forgiveness. But time does not forgive. It observes. As months pass, the quiet work continues. Information that felt harmless in isolation begins to connect with other fragments. The shape of intention becomes clearer. Roles define themselves. What once seemed like coincidence becomes recognizable as coordination. And then, sometimes without a single dramatic instant, the moment of convergence arrives. Not as chaos, not as spectacle, but as presence. Suddenly, the silence that once protected no longer feels empty. It feels occupied. Ordinary spaces feel unfamiliar. Routine feels interrupted, even if nothing visible has changed. This is the moment when people begin to sense, not through evidence, but through instinct, that the distance they believed existed is gone. For the first time, consequences feel real again. The power of the digital trail is not that it creates truth, it reveals it. It does not invent actions, it simply connects them. And once connected, denial becomes a fragile position to stand on. Stories unravel under their own weight. Gaps grow difficult to explain. What once felt like secrecy now feels like memory stored somewhere beyond anyone's control. This stage is marked by a strange reversal. For years, power was exercised through control of information. Now information begins to exercise power of its own. The balance that once favored fear begins to tilt toward accountability. But accountability does not rush. It waits until it can move with certainty. Those who built their confidence on invisibility begin to sense that invisibility fading, not suddenly, slowly, through subtle changes in attention, through the tightening of spaces that once felt open, through the quiet realization that there may be no true edge left to step beyond. The emotional shift at this stage is profound. Where once there was urgency, now there is anticipation. Where once there was panic, now there is uncertainty mixed with waiting. The future no longer feels open. It feels scheduled. From the outside, people often ask why it takes so long, why answers are delayed, why resolution seems distant. But this delay is not weakness. It is preparation. It is the careful work of ensuring that when the net finally moves, it does not miss its shape. And when movement finally becomes visible, it rarely arrives with drama in the way people expect. It arrives as a transition, a shift from one phase of life into another, a moment when routines are interrupted not by chaos, but by precision. What follows is not the end of fear, but the relocation of it. Fear no longer flows outward through reputation. It moves inward, through reflection, through memory, through the sudden awareness of how every choice left behind a trace. For those who once believed themselves untouchable, the most jarring realization is not loss of freedom, it is loss of narrative. The story they told themselves about control no longer belongs to them alone. It now exists outside, documented, interpreted, and carried forward by forces beyond their reach. This is the quiet power of the modern world. It does not need to confront loudly. It allows people to build their own record, and then reflects it back with impartial clarity. What once felt hidden becomes simply documented. And with that documentation comes a different kind of ending, not one shaped by shock, but by reckoning. The final chapter, then, is not defined by a single act, but a slow closing of distance between action and consequence. It is defined by the realization that movement was never truly invisible, that even the quietest decisions cast the longest shadows. What remains after this convergence is not satisfaction, and not always closure. It is understanding. Understanding of how quickly ordinary moments can transform, how pressure reshapes choice, how power feeds on fear, and how fear eventually leaves footprints that cannot be erased. In the end, this story is not only about a moment beneath a bridge, or a clash of authority, or a trail of messages. It is about the invisible thread that connects all of those things. The idea that no action exists in isolation once it enters the world. And the final truth is this: long after the tension fades from memory, long after routines return and faces change, the echoes of those choices continue to move forward, quietly shaping futures that will never fully know where their origin began. Because every story built in shadow eventually learns how to reflect. For more real UK true crime stories told with depth and truth, subscribe now and stay with us.